There are places in this world that look perfectly safe on the surface. Wide open trails, sunlit clearings, the soft sound of water moving over rocks somewhere nearby. Places where the air smells like pine and earth and freedom, and where the biggest thing on your mind is whether you packed enough snacks for the walk back. Most of the time, that's exactly what those places are. Peaceful, quiet, restorative in a way that nothing else in modern life quite manages to be. But sometimes, and I want you to really sit with this because it matters, sometimes the wilderness holds something back from you, something it doesn't show you right away. A danger that hides inside the beauty until the moment it decides not to anymore. And on the days when that happens, everything changes in a heartbeat. The stories you're about to hear come from real people, ordinary men and women who went out into the great outdoors the same way thousands of people do every single weekend across this country. They laced up their boots, they packed their bags, they felt that familiar rush of excitement that comes with leaving the noise of everyday life behind. And then something happened to each of them that they were not prepared for, something that, in some cases, they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. A child with a bow and arrows and eyes that held no warmth. A strange hermit living by rules that no one else could understand. A car left abandoned in the forest with a knife and a message meant only for one person. And a patch of ground that simply opened up and swallowed someone whole. These are not ghost stories, though some of them might make you feel like they are. These are real accounts from real hikers, people just like you and me, who went looking for a little peace and quiet in the wilderness and found something far more unsettling instead. So, before we get into it, go ahead and get comfortable. Make yourself a warm drink if you'd like. And if you're new here, welcome. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our community right now because we share stories like these every single week and you are absolutely going to want to be here for every one of them. Now let's begin. Story 1. The Boy in the Trees. Between the years of 2011 and 2015, a man named Jay and his best friend developed what you might generously call a hiking habit, though by the end of those 4 years it had grown into something much more than that. They lived out in Missouri, and in the early days their trips were wonderfully simple things. A good day's walk through familiar local spots, a cold beer or two at the end of it, some food cooking over a campfire, and the kind of easy, comfortable silence that only exists between people who have known each other a long time. That was all they needed back then, and for a while it was more than enough. But something happens when you spend enough time in the outdoors. It gets into you. It changes the way you think about comfort and challenge and what you're actually capable of. And so, by the time 2015 rolled around, one day of leisurely hiking just didn't cut it for them anymore. The itch had grown too big for a single day to scratch. That's when the two of them made the jump to overnight camping, and everything shifted from there. Their first overnight trip was at Three Creeks Conservation Area, and after that, they hit up Pinnacles Youth Park, which, as the narrator was quick to point out with a certain amount of pride, was technically only permitted for day use. So for one night at least they were, in his words, outlaws. Then came Eagle Bluffs, and then a whole stretch of weekends out at Mark Twain, trip after trip until the place started to feel like a second backyard to them. Natural, familiar, theirs in the way that only the places you love can ever really be yours. By the time they'd racked up close to 20 hiking and camping trips together, they were ready for something bigger. And they found it in the Ozark National Forest, all the way down in Arkansas. Important to understand about the Ozarks, and the narrator wanted to make sure this was perfectly clear. Most of Missouri and a good chunk of northern Arkansas is technically speaking part of the Ozarks. But saying that is a little like saying all ocean is the same because it's all water. The northern and central parts where these two men had grown up are mostly flat open plains, comfortable, familiar, settled-looking land that doesn't ask much of you. But the further south you drive, the more the land begins to change its mind about what it wants to be. The flatness gives way, the farms thin out, the trees crowd in. And then the hills start, real hills, the kind that climb and roll and seem to go on forever, rising sometimes to nearly 1,000 feet above you. These are the mountains of Arkansas and Oklahoma, and while they're still technically part of the same Ozarks, the difference between that terrain and the flat plains up north is, as he put it, about as dramatic as the difference between a calm pond and a river in full flood. The part of the Ozarks that most people know, the resorts, the casinos, the big shiny family attractions around Branson and the Lake of the Ozarks, that's the civilized face of it. That's the postcard version. But keep driving south past all of that, past the last strip of flat farmland and friendly-looking small towns, and eventually the land stops pretending to be tame. The forest takes over, the creeks multiply fed by countless streams running off the White River. The paths narrow, the hills press in close. And for two men who had spent 4 years slowly graduating from casual day hikes to serious multi-night wilderness camping, this was about as close to paradise as they could reasonably imagine. They drove all the way down to a small town called Limestone, where they made a donation to the local church in exchange for permission to park their car in the church lot for a couple of days. From there, the plan was refreshingly simple and enormously appealing. A nice, leisurely 16-mile route spread out over 3 nights. The first night they would camp at a place called Car Wash Falls, the second night at Big Piney Creek, the third night back at Car Wash Falls again, and then a straightforward walk back to the car and from there home. 16 miles, 3 nights. 2 experienced hikers with everything they needed and absolutely nothing to worry about. That was the plan, and they were thrilled with it. Because wild camping, as the narrator described it, operates a little like a drug, not in a reckless or dangerous sense, but in the way that each experience you have raises the bar for what excites you next time. You always need something a little bigger, a little more challenging, a little more remote, to feel that same pure rush of freedom and accomplishment. And this trip, the mountains, the rivers, the real serious southern Ozark wilderness, this was the biggest and the most ambitious thing they had attempted yet. They were prepared, too. More than prepared, really. 4 years of trips had taught them lessons the hard way, and they had taken every single one of those lessons to heart. They carried bear mace. They had aqua tabs for water purification. They had a .357 revolver between them. They each packed their own fully stocked first aid kit, one in each of their bags, because they understood that if something happened to one of them and the other couldn't help, you needed to be your own emergency room. These were 2 men who had earned their confidence through experience and who took their safety as seriously as they took their love of the outdoors. And still, some things can't be prepared for. Some lessons you have to learn all over again, no matter how much you think you already know. The first day of the trip was, in his words, about as perfect as you could imagine. The route they had chosen was well planned and easy to follow, which meant they spent much more time actually walking and much less time squinting at maps and second-guessing themselves. Car Wash Falls made for a truly beautiful first campsite, with fresh water all around them, the sound of falling water nearby, and the kind of deep, satisfying tiredness at the end of the day that only comes from a long walk in genuinely beautiful country. They cooked a good campfire dinner, they settled in, and the night was quiet and restful. And then the morning arrived. He woke up, and Jay wasn't in his shelter. Now, that alone wasn't anything to worry about. Camping mornings often meant early risers heading off to take care of necessities, or just stepping away to clear their heads with a little solitude. So he didn't panic, he just looked around. And sure enough, there was Jay, standing at the edge of the tree line, looking up the wooded slope that climbed between them and the waterfall. Just standing there, very still, very focused on something up in those trees. He gave Jay a loud whistle. Jay turned his head for just a second, then went right back to staring at the slope. That was enough to make him call out properly, asking what had caught Jay's attention so completely. He figured Jay would just shout the answer back over his shoulder, but instead Jay stayed quiet, and then slowly, deliberately, he turned around and walked back to camp. He kept glancing over his shoulder as he came. That careful, repetitive checking of the tree line was the thing that made the narrator stand up straighter and start paying closer attention. That kind of body language in his experience usually meant one thing. He guessed it had been a black bear. Jay shook his head. No, not a bear. A person. Someone had been standing at the tree line watching them. Jay had only noticed as he'd started walking toward the falls for his morning wash, and at first it hadn't seemed like a particularly big deal. Someone out for an early hike, maybe. Someone who had spotted their camp from a distance. Nothing inherently threatening about that. Jay had even raised his hand and waved at the figure, a youngish man it looked like, in the easy, friendly way that hikers greet each other in the backcountry. But instead of waving back, the man turned and jogged up the slope, away from Jay, into the trees. Jay told himself the guy had probably just wanted to give him some privacy, figuring Jay was heading to the falls for a wash. And he was right that it wasn't necessarily anything sinister. People in the woods act all kinds of ways. But then Jay got to the falls and rinsed himself off in the cold water, and when he looked up the track, there was that same person again, 60, maybe 70 yards away, watching him, standing completely still just watching as Jay cleaned up. Jay said he had the strong urge to shout something pretty unfriendly at the man, but he held his tongue. You don't antagonize fellow hikers. You especially don't antagonize locals if you can help it. So he said nothing, finished up, and when he turned to leave the falls, the watcher was gone. Good enough, he thought. But walking back through the trees toward their grassy campsite, Jay got that unmistakable crawling sensation on the back of his neck, that tight, prickling certainty that someone is behind you, He stopped, he turned around, and there was the man again, up at the tree line near the track watching Jay walk away, just standing there in the trees watching. That's why Jay had been standing at the tree line when the narrator woke up. That's why his walk back to camp had been slow and watchful. And that's why, once Jay relayed the whole thing, they didn't discuss it for very long before deciding on the obvious, time-proven solution. They packed up and moved on. This wasn't the first time they'd encountered someone behaving oddly in the woods, not even close. Over the years, they'd been accused of hunting out of season, of trespassing on private land, of all sorts of things. Sometimes people had just been confrontational for what seemed like no reason at all, just looking for a reason to make another person's day worse. But every single time, without exception, the solution had been simple. Walk a couple of miles in any direction, out of sight, out of mind. No one had ever followed them. No one had ever escalated things beyond that first uneasy interaction. So they hiked about 2 miles south, stopped in the shade to eat a quick breakfast, and got back to enjoying their trip. And the rest of that second day was genuinely wonderful. They made it to Big Piney Creek right around dinner time, and after 7 miles of good walking, dipping into that full, cold creek felt absolutely incredible. They were tired, content, and very much in the kind of peaceful headspace that makes you feel like the whole world is exactly the right size. They set up camp. They hung their food bags in the tree line. They sat around the campfire with a bottle of whiskey passing between them, and for a while, everything was exactly as it should have been. And then a sound came from the tree line, about 50 yards behind them. If you've ever been out camping and found yourself leaning toward the darkness trying to figure out what just moved out there, you already know exactly what that moment feels like. Drop a comment and let us know if something like this has ever happened to you. Their first thought was a deer, maybe sniffing at their food bags. Their second thought was a bear, a black bear, which is more of a nuisance than a genuine threat, but still more than capable of making a complete mess of your food supply if it decides your carefully hung bag looks worth the effort. And since they'd brought only as much food as they needed for the trip, losing it would have been a real problem. So they did what experienced campers do. They grabbed their flashlights, ran toward the tree line, made a lot of noise, waved the lights around, and whatever was there scattered. They heard it running but never caught sight of it. They walked back to the fire, settled in again, and figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. Maybe 15 minutes later, something started moving in the distant trees. Not near the food bags this time. Just creeping quietly along a different part of the tree line, pausing for long stretches, then moving again, slow and methodical, like something, or someone, pacing just at the edge of the darkness, staying quiet, staying still for long enough that you'd almost convince yourself you'd imagined it. They honestly figured it was just a deer, a curious one. They'd been camping enough times by then that a distant, non-aggressive animal didn't rattle them in the slightest, especially not with the bear mace and the gun right there within reach. What was unsettling wasn't what the thing was. It was how long it stayed, even after they put out the fire. Even after they climbed into their shelters and lay down in complete darkness, they could still hear it. The occasional dry crack of a branch, the soft, slow crunch of something moving through the leaves. Jay would murmur through the darkness, "You hear that? There it is again." And each time they laughed it off the way they always did. Because what else do? You laugh at the darkness and you tell yourself it's nothing. Eventually, whatever it was retreated slowly back into the deeper woods. The sounds faded. The forest went quiet, and after a long while he finally relaxed enough to sleep. The following morning was tense, that much was honest. The memory of the thing in the tree line was right there at the front of their minds, coloring the ordinary morning routines with a faint unease they couldn't quite shake. But the plan was to pack up and move on, just as they always did. They were heading back north toward Carwash Falls, this time planning to camp somewhere a little less visible, a quieter, more sheltered spot where passing strangers or nosy locals were less likely to take an interest in them. What they didn't know, what it would take him years to fully believe, was that all of it might have been connected. The watcher at the falls, the thing in the tree line at night, all of it. One single entity that had been tracking them through the wilderness the whole time, patient and unhurried, biding its time. But that's getting ahead of things. It was early afternoon. They were walking the trail, making good progress, feeling relatively easy about the day, when Jay announced that he needed to take a bathroom break. He grabbed the necessary supplies, some wipes and the small folding shovel they always carried for exactly this purpose, and walked up a low rise just off the trail, the kind of slight hill that flattens out at the top and disappears from view after about 20 or 30 yards. He left the narrator sitting on the trail with the packs. A quiet couple of minutes, that's all it was going to be. And then Jay's voice rang out from just over that rise. "Whoa! Hey there, little buddy. You just about scared the crap out of me. The narrator couldn't tell from the tone whether Jay was talking to an animal or a person, so he got up and went to find out. He came up over that rise and through the trees at the top, and there, right in front of him, was Jay, facing down a child. A boy, 11 or 12 years old at most, brown-haired. And the best single word the narrator could find for him was neglected. His clothes were worn and too big for him, the kind of hand-me-downs that had been worn by more than one person before getting to you. And in his hand he was holding what looked at first glance like a toy bow, small, roughly made, with a little quiver of what looked like toy arrows hanging from his back. The narrator had assumed it was a toy because of how small everything was, because of the handmade look of it, because he genuinely could not process the alternative, that this kid was out here alone in the wilderness with a real functional bow and arrow, completely unsupervised. He got closer. The boy reached back into his quiver and drew out one of the arrows. No bright shiny metal tip that he could see clearly, but no rubber safety stopper at the end either. Nothing that said this was made for play. He turned to Jay and asked the question that was screaming in his head. "Dude, is that thing real?" Jay turned the question straight to the boy. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he turned his face so the narrator could see it clearly for just a moment. And what he saw was a face that was genuinely unsettling in a way he struggled to describe. There was something wrong with his right eye, a lazy eye, and something in the boy's expression that was all wrong for the situation. No embarrassment, no friendliness, no curiosity the way a child caught somewhere he shouldn't be usually looks. Just a blank, flat, deliberate kind of attention. He looked back at Jay, placed the arrow on the string, and pulled it back. And that sound, that tight, almost musical creak of genuine tension in the bowstring, that was the answer. No toy ever made that sound. This was real. They ran, or they tried to, because a second later Jay let out a scream that stopped the narrator cold for half a heartbeat. Not a shout of fright, but a shout of pain. Real pain, sharp and sudden and unmistakable. He was already closer to the slope leading down to their packs, so he got there first and looked back up, and what he saw made his blood go cold. Jay had 2 arrows in him, 2 small wooden arrows, handmade and real, sticking out of his body. One in the shoulder, one near his hip, much lower. Jay was screaming at him to get the gun, and he was already reaching for it, hands moving before his brain had fully caught up with what was happening. And within a second or two, he had the 357 raised and aimed up at the top of that rise, where the boy had chased them and now stood looking down. The boy let one more arrow fly. He heard it cut through the air beside his head, close enough that it was audible, a sharp whipping sound that he would never fully forget. And then he fired. The boy disappeared, ran, gone into the trees as fast and as silently as he'd arrived. He knew he'd missed, because there was no other possible explanation for the boy still being on his feet when he bolted. And then as the boy vanished into the tree line, he didn't fire again. He couldn't shoot a child in the back as he ran away, even a child who had just put 2 arrows into his best friend. It wasn't something he was able to do. Maybe if he had been the one bleeding, he later said, things might have been different. But he wasn't, and the moment passed, and the boy was gone. Jay did not see it that way. Jay, who was standing there in pain with arrows protruding from his body, was furious that the boy hadn't been stopped. The narrator understood it completely. But there are some things you can't bring yourself to do, and that was one of them. And so he pushed that argument aside and focused on the only thing that mattered right now, getting help. He already knew there would be no cell signal this deep in the valley. So the 2 of them started moving, Jay wincing with every single step, each footfall sending fresh waves of pain through his injured shoulder and hip. They crossed to the opposite side of the valley, working their way up to higher ground for elevation and signal. The narrator kept his head on a swivel the entire way, his hand tight on the gun, scanning the trees behind them. It sounds almost comical now, he admitted. 2 grown men afraid of a boy. But if you had seen those arrows in your friend, and if you had seen the expression in that child's eyes right before he drew his bow, you would not have been laughing either. There was no play in that boy, no hesitation. Whatever he was doing, he had meant every inch of it. They climbed high enough to get a signal. He dialed 911 with the Ozark wilderness spread out below them like a rolling green sea, and when the call connected, he felt an almost physical wave of relief wash over him. Like this video if you've ever been out in the wilderness and felt something go deeply wrong. That moment when you realize the situation is much more serious than you thought. He explained everything to the dispatcher, gave their GPS coordinates, described their surroundings, as clearly and specifically as he could. The dispatcher told them to stay put, stay on the line, and above all, and this was critical, Do not try to pull those arrows out. Removing them would only worsen the bleeding and potentially cause far greater damage. The dispatcher transferred them to the county sheriff's department, and a deputy came on the line. He asked if the person who had shot Jay was still nearby. He was told no, that the boy had run when fired upon and hadn't been seen since. The deputy told them a search and rescue team was being mobilized immediately. Ground crews would be with them within 40 minutes if the terrain allowed. If the terrain proved too rough, they would bring in a helicopter. After about 15 minutes, the adrenaline that had been keeping them both sharp and focused began to ease off. And that's when the full weight of Jay's pain came crashing in. He was suffering more with every passing minute, the wounds aching and pulling with the kind of deep, insistent pain that only gets louder once the shock wears off. They waited for word on whether a helicopter from Arkansas or Missouri's Air Care Service had been dispatched, knowing that in terrain like this, ground crews might simply take too long. But the system worked. Within a few minutes, his phone was buzzing with an incoming call from a flight nurse. The nurse guided them step by step, walking them downhill, back toward a clearing he had identified from their GPS data that could serve as a makeshift landing zone. He told them to get there, stay visible, and wait. Help was coming as fast as it possibly could. Jay said afterward that knowing help was on the way made the pain easier to carry. His shirt and pants were soaked through with blood by then, and he'd laid himself down on his front to keep as still as possible, knowing that movement was making everything worse. But knowing rescue was minutes away, that changed everything. And then, at last, the sound of rotor blades cutting through the air from somewhere in the distance, the rescue helicopter closing in. There was still good light in the sky, which meant the crew had no trouble spotting them, and after one pass to confirm their position, the chopper came down lower, hovering above the clearing. A specialized stretcher was lowered on a rope, and one of the medics rode it down. Before Jay could be placed on the stretcher, the medic cleaned and dressed both wounds, clipping the arrows down carefully so that Jay could lie on his back without the shafts causing further pain. Jay asked why the medic couldn't just pull them out right there. He had his full kit with him after all. The medic's answer was clear and firm. Removing arrows in the field was not safe. ER doctors in a clean, sterile environment were the right people to do that job, and that was a much better option than anything he could manage in the middle of the Ozark wilderness. The narrator had expected at that point that this was where he and Jay would separate, that he'd climb back down, hike out on his own, find the car, and drive to wherever they were taking Jay. But it turned out there was room in the helicopter for both of them. And so he experienced his one and only helicopter ride with his wounded best friend lying at his feet, looking out the window as the great green expanse of the Ozarks fell away beneath them. He looked down into the tree line as they lifted off, half expecting to see a small figure watching from below. There was no one. After landing, after the hospital waiting room, after what felt like a very long couple of hours staring at institutional walls and bad vending machine coffee, a doctor came out and told him that Jay's surgery had been successful. The arrows had been removed cleanly. Neither had struck anything vital. They wanted to keep him overnight as a precaution, to monitor for infection, to make sure the wounds were clean and healing properly. But the prognosis was good. Very good. Then came the deputy from the county, who arrived to do a formal interview. They talked the whole way back, a 90-minute drive to where they had started, where the sheriff and a group of park rangers had set up a small temporary headquarters at the church parking lot in Limestone. Search teams had already been out on the trails for hours, and after all that searching, nothing, no evidence, no trail, no sign of who the boy was or where he had come from. The narrator collected both their packs from one of the rangers, got in the car, and drove back to wait for Jay's discharge. He found a cheap motel, paid for a room, showered, and fell into the deepest sleep of his life. Or tried to. The nightmares kept finding him, pulling him awake every couple of hours. His mind wouldn't fully rest knowing Jay was still in a hospital somewhere unfamiliar. He kept checking the time until, finally, the call came that Jay was cleared to go. Seeing him again was one hell of a reunion, but the good feeling didn't last long, because after the reunion came the conversation with the sheriff's deputy, and the narrator said he would never forget what that man told him. "Keep your expectations low," the deputy said. The people who lived out in those hills were a world apart from the friendly faces you'd find in town. They kept to themselves. They lived by their own rules, by customs that had been passed down for generations, in communities that had very little use for the law or for outsiders. And if one of their own, even a child, had done something like this, those communities would close ranks and protect that person completely. The deputy said he and his colleagues had been navigating that reality for as long as anyone in the department could remember. And then the deputy said something that the narrator found genuinely shocking. He said that in his honest opinion, the best thing the narrator could have done out there was shoot that boy dead while he had the chance. that he would have done the whole community a real favor and saved someone a whole lot of trouble down the line. He said it matter-of-factly, like a man who had given up being surprised by the world he worked in a long time ago. And after all of it, the arrows, the helicopter, the hospital, the deputy's quiet, world-weary voice, the narrator drove home and tried to figure out how to put it all behind him. Story 2, Cornbread. Now, the next story takes us somewhere a little different. Not a crisis, not exactly a danger, but something that lingers in a particular way, the way memories of strange and unexplainable people tend to linger long after the people themselves are gone. This one comes from someone who grew up in a tiny place called Kyle, in North Carolina. Small doesn't even cover it. A church, a pond, a community library, and just about nothing else. But what Kyle had, right there on its doorstep, was the Nantahala National Forest. Miles and miles of deep, genuine, wild forest that stretched out in every direction like an invitation. And when you're young and there isn't much else to do, you accept that invitation every single day. That's how this person and their friends came to know the man they called Cornbread. Cornbread wasn't actually his name. They never found out his real name because every single time they asked, he gave them a different one, a new name each time, pulled from somewhere in that peculiar internal world he seemed to inhabit. Eventually, they heard him hollering about cornbread while walking through the woods one day, and the name stuck in the way that only perfectly suited nicknames ever do. What Cornbread was, in the plainest possible terms, was a hermit, a man who had chosen the forest as his home and who lived there entirely, apart from the rest of the world. He bothered hikers occasionally. He bothered locals every now and then, but he was, for all of that, ultimately harmless. Everyone more or less agreed on that. He was a fixture of that patch of Nantahala the way a particular old rock or an oddly shaped tree becomes a fixture, strange and familiar at the same time, a landmark that belongs to the landscape. He had his wholesome side, too, and it was genuinely hard not to feel a kind of warmth toward it. Cornbread, for instance, liked to eat his meals in the company of wildlife. People had heard stories of him roasting birds or rabbits over small fires out in the forest, but the narrator only ever witnessed something far gentler than that. They saw him once eating from a can, spooning out whatever was inside with unhurried contentment, and then carefully scooping a small portion out onto the ground beside him. Then he backed away, sat perfectly still, and waited, and after a while, a bird landed and began pecking at it. Cornbread sat there eating his own meal with that bird right beside him, a slow, wide smile spreading across his face, chuckling softly to himself every so often the way someone does when something fills them with uncomplicated joy. At the time, as a kid, they thought it was the most wonderful thing they'd ever seen. Like cornbread existed at a different frequency from everybody else, more tuned in to the rhythm of the natural world, more at home in it, more genuinely at peace. They were too young then to fully understand what else that life cost a person. There was the day they saw him while walking through the woods and called out a friendly greeting. He waved back cheerfully enough, but then turned to the trees surrounding him and said hello to every single one. "Hello, tree. Hello, tree. Hello, tree." Said it with complete sincerity, as if each tree were an old acquaintance deserving of its own individual acknowledgement. As kids, they burst out laughing, and Cornbread seemed very pleased with that. But as the narrator grew older and looked back on that memory, the laughter started to feel a little less comfortable, because people who knew Cornbread said that was no act, that he'd been having full, earnest conversations with trees for years, that sometimes, late at night, he could be heard singing them lullabies, soft, half-heard songs drifting through the dark trees along the trail. People said it was one of the most unsettling things they'd ever stumbled into in the dark, that faint, earnest singing with no obvious source and no explanation. Cornbread also had this habit of referring to himself as we. As children, they just found it funny, another one of his little quirks. But looking back through adult eyes, it starts to feel like something a little heavier, a man who believed that whoever, or whatever, he was not alone in it. Then there were the tiny homes he built in the forest, little teepee-shaped structures made of sticks and twigs and whatever cord he had on hand, built in clusters throughout the woods. He kept them stocked with food scraps, made sure creatures were living in them, sometimes insects, sometimes something larger, and wandered between them with the proprietary air of a landlord checking in on his tenants. On paper, sweet. In practice, when you rounded a bend in the trail and suddenly found yourself in the middle of what amounted to a miniature village of jagged, crooked little stick huts stretching off in every direction, the feeling was not sweetness. The feeling was a very sudden and urgent desire to know exactly where their builder currently was. And then there were the mason jars. The narrator never witnessed this personally, but heard it from enough different sources that they believed it completely. Somewhere out in that forest, Cornbread kept a collection of glass mason jars. Not filled with trash or debris, he wasn't keeping litter. What he kept was things that had been lost. A hairband found on the trail, a single glove, a button that had come loose from someone's coat and fallen without them noticing. Anything that had been dropped or left behind, he collected and gave a home to in those jars, which he apparently stashed in places only he knew about in the depths of the forest. And one time, a hunter out in the woods spotted Cornbread with one of those jars, cradling it against his chest like something precious, his head bent down, whispering softly to it. Nobody ever found out what he was saying. Sometimes you'd come across what looked like small, crude chairs, constructions of sticks and twigs that looked like furniture but were far too flimsy to bear any actual weight, as a friend of the narrator proved to everyone's amusement by sitting on one and immediately landing in a pile of splinters. But they weren't built for people. Cornbread built them for ghosts. People in the community said he would sit in front of them on certain nights, perfectly still in the darkness, waiting for one to arrive and tell him its story. He also wrote letters, careful, serious letters, as if they were meant for real people who might actually read them. But instead of mailing them, he attached them to tree trunks, pinned to small notches he'd carved into the bark specifically for that purpose. The narrator and their friends found one once and took it down. The letter was addressed in his careful handwriting to tomorrow, as though he believed that the future itself might pass by that trail one day and notice his message waiting there. He apparently told random hikers about things that hadn't happened yet. The story that had started that particular rumor was about a local woman whose mother was seriously ill with cancer, going through what everyone suspected would be her last round of chemotherapy at the cancer center over in Franklin. Cornbread passed her on the trail one day and told her simply and plainly, with total conviction, "Your mama's going to be just fine." A couple of weeks later, the woman's mother got word from her doctors that the cancer was gone. The narrator was careful to note that they couldn't vouch for all the rumors. There was another one about Cornbread telling a hiker that their time was short, and that same hiker later went missing in another part of the country. That one was harder to know what to do with, but whatever the truth of his predictions, Cornbread had another side that showed itself mainly to outsiders, to hikers passing through who didn't know him and hadn't grown up alongside his particular brand of strangeness. To those people, Cornbread was something else entirely. He would follow groups of hikers through the trees, listening to their conversations without being seen, and then he'd use what he'd heard against them, because Cornbread was a remarkably gifted mimic. The narrator remembered the time he mimicked the voice of a friend's mother so convincingly that they were all completely certain she had actually come looking for them in the woods. Before it slowly became clear that it was Cornbread, delighted with himself somewhere in the trees. If he could do that to people who knew him, you can only imagine what he was capable of doing to a group of strangers who had no idea what was out there in the forest with them. He'd give false directions to hikers who asked for them, and more than one group of students from nearby colleges had ended up comprehensively, miserably lost after trusting Cornbread's confident guidance. They would eventually find their way back to town and complain about some strange man in the woods who had played a mean, disorienting trick on them. And for solo hikers, those he found alone on the trail, he saved his most personal piece of mischief. He would carve small figures out of sticks no thicker than a finger, detailed enough that the hairstyle and clothing were recognizable, specific, unmistakably based on the person he'd been watching. He would leave these carvings on their cars when they returned to the parking area, and instead of carving proper eyes onto the small figures, Cornbread always carved small, neat X's where the eyes should have been. The narrator admitted freely that no matter how well they knew Cornbread, no matter how many years of familiarity they had with his ways, finding something like that on their car would have unsettled them too. He also had a habit, when he was near someone he wanted to unnerve, of fixing his gaze on a point just past their shoulder, as though he could clearly see someone walking up right behind them, and holding that gaze, and smiling, faintly and privately, at whatever he was seeing there. As the years went on and the narrator grew up, Cornbread's behavior began to shift in other ways. The gentleness he had always reserved for the local children slowly fell away. He started talking more urgently, more anxiously, about things that unsettled the adults who encountered him on the trail. He would try to explain, with growing frustration, as though the failure was his inability to find the right words, that the woods used to have more doors, that something had changed, that the doors were gone and he could no longer find them, and the loss of them clearly distressed him in a way that was painful to watch. He would talk about invisible lines running through the forest, lines that were genuinely dangerous to cross, and how many of the people who had gone missing in wild places over the years had simply not known they were crossing one. He made enormous, circuitous detours to avoid these lines, adding hours to journeys that could have been walked in a fraction of the time, because whatever lay on the other side of those lines was worse in his mind than any inconvenience. And there were things the narrator witnessed directly. Cornbread sometimes stood in a particular spot in the forest and simply stopped, completely and utterly still, not sleeping, not resting, just motionless in the way that a stone is motionless. Minutes would pass. You could shout his name, you could stand right beside him, and he would not move, not a flinch, not a blink, as though whatever was animating him had simply stepped away for a while. And then there was the day, completely out of nowhere, in the middle of an ordinary encounter, when Cornbread told the narrator and their friends that he hadn't slept in years, because, he explained, using the plural he always used for himself, it's safer if one of us stays awake. Nobody had asked, nobody had prompted it, he just said it, the way he said many things. As a statement of fact that happened to be true, whether you were ready to hear it or not. As far as the narrator knew, Cornbread was still out in those woods when they left for college. But somewhere around that time, the sightings started to thin. People who knew him said he was slowing down, getting older, looking tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. And then there was a stretch of months when nobody saw him at all. And then those months became years. Most people who grew up in Kyle and who knew Cornbread the way the narrator knew him had come, in the time since, to believe the same thing, that he was gone, that he had died out there somewhere in the forest that had been his home, and that he was now, slowly and quietly, becoming part of it in the way that everything eventually does. There was something right about that when you thought about it. Story 3, The Knife in the Photo. A few years back, a person got together with a group of old college friends for a reunion. They'd met at UCLA back in the 90s. A tight-knit group of people who had spent a great deal of their student years hiking together, mostly in the Santa Monica Mountains and sometimes in the Angeles National Forest. For their reunion, it was the Angeles they chose. Second time around, a little older, a little more settled, but still the same people underneath. They had dinner, they had drinks, they stayed the night at the narrator's place, and then in the early morning hours they drove out to the Angeles to begin their day's hike. The hiking was wonderful. There's something almost impossibly good about being back on a trail with people you used to walk trails with years ago. The conversation, the shared memories, the easy rhythm of old friendship falling back into place like it was never away. By the time they made it back to the trailhead and back to where the car was parked, everyone was satisfied and glowing and exactly the right kind of tired. Except the car wasn't there. The narrator stood at the spot where they'd parked and simply could not make it register. The space was empty. Just an empty patch of parking lot where a car was supposed to be. It took a few long, disbelieving minutes before the obvious conclusion landed with its full weight: the car had been stolen. There was the predictable process of going from, this isn't happening, to, okay, this is actually happening, to genuinely, properly furious about it. They called the police from the trailhead, made the report, and then called a cab to take them all to a Korean barbecue restaurant, because that had been the plan for the end of the day, regardless and honestly, given the circumstances. A table full of good food and strong drinks felt more necessary than ever. An hour or so into the meal, after progressing through what could only be described as the stages of car theft grief, they reached a kind of detached acceptance. The car was gone. It was insured. It was someone else's problem now, in the most immediate sense. The narrator decided they hated that car anyway, and that the thief had probably done them a favor. Pure bluster, obviously, as they were the first to admit, because when an LA County Sheriff's deputy called and told them the car had been found, the feeling was something extremely close to pure joy. Less than 3 hours after the initial report, found and recovered. It felt like a genuine miracle, until the deputy started explaining the details. The car had been found abandoned, driven off the main road and down a trail through the forest by whoever had taken it. That was unusual, but not incomprehensible. Thieves sometimes drove stolen cars off-road to strip them, or simply to make them harder to find. But then the deputy asked a question that hit the narrator like cold water. Do you know of anyone who might wish to do you harm? No, of course not. Who thinks they have an enemy capable of something like this? The deputy pressed a little further. Had they argued with anyone recently? Had they upset anyone, made anyone angry enough to hold a grudge? And that's when he explained what had been found in the car. The narrator had brought a photo album on the drive out to the forest. A thick one, packed with dozens of photographs from their college years, many of them taken on those very hikes through the Santa Monicas and the Angeles. Memories, carefully preserved and brought along to share with old friends. Inside the car, one photograph had been removed from the album, one specific photograph, and notably one in which none of the narrator's friends appeared, only the narrator, alone. That photograph had been stabbed into the dashboard with a knife that did not belong to the narrator, a knife that the thief had brought with them. The deputy had to repeat himself twice before the information actually settled into full comprehension. And that's precisely why he kept asking about enemies, about arguments, about anyone who might have had a specific reason to send a specific message to a specific person. Because this was not the work of a random thief who happened to grab the nearest car in the nearest lot. This was something that felt deliberate, something that felt pointed, something that felt in the most unsettling possible way personal. The narrator's friends did their best. They offered every rational reassurance they could think of, that it was most likely a strange coincidence, that the thief had probably just grabbed a random photo and the knife was already in the car from somewhere. That there was no way this was personal because there was no reason for it to be personal. But reason doesn't always reach the feeling, and the feeling stayed. The insurance company handled the repairs. The car came back a few weeks later looking almost as good as new, and the narrator tried to go back to normal with it. They tried getting in it and driving it and not thinking about it. But it didn't work. The memory of what had been done inside that car, the knife, the photo, the deliberateness of it came back every time. And so they sold it quickly and at a loss, just to be rid of it. Because the thought that kept returning, no matter how hard they tried to push it away, was this: whoever had done this had been watching them, had possibly been watching them for long enough to know which car was theirs and which face in the photos was the one that mattered. And if they had worked out where that car was parked most of the time, if they had driven past an apartment building enough times to notice a particular car in a particular spot, well, next time it might not just be a photograph with a knife in it. If this story gave you chills, share it with someone you know who loves the outdoors, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single story. We have so many more coming. Story 4, The Sinkhole. After graduating from college, a woman moved to Jacksonville for work, knowing nobody in the city, starting completely fresh. The way you rebuild a social life from nothing when you're in your mid-20s is often slower and more awkward than you expect. But for her, a stroke of good fortune arrived in the form of a yoga class, an all-female class specifically. And in that class, she found 2 women who turned out to have an enormous amount in common with her. Health-conscious, independent, deeply in love with the natural world. The kind of women you don't find twice. It didn't take long before the 3 of them were hiking together regularly. It became their exercise, their therapy, their weekly escape from the noise and pressure of adult life. For this narrator, though, it grew into something beyond even that. There was a quality to the feeling she got from those hikes that she couldn't quite find anywhere else. The release of tension, the humility that comes from standing somewhere genuinely wild and untamed and realizing how small and temporary and wonderfully ordinary you actually are. She described it as a combination of burning off steam and gratitude. The kind of deep, bone-level thankfulness for every ordinary luxury that you feel most sharply after spending a few hours somewhere that has no ordinary luxuries at all. Hiking had become, she said, a genuine pillar of her well-being. So when both friends happened to cancel on the same day at short notice, she made a decision that her future self would have very complicated feelings about. She went anyway, solo. She chose to explore the Ocala National Forest. Ocala, about an hour's drive away, a place she had never visited before. Ocala is a different kind of wilderness from what most people picture when they think of forests. It has deep swampland, abundant wildlife, and thick subtropical vegetation, but also enough firm, solid ground to make for a genuine, satisfying hike. She went in expecting beauty, and that was exactly what she found. It was, she said, one of the most breathtaking places she had ever walked through. She has never been back. It was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon when she was moving through a wide, sandy stretch of trail, tall pines rising on either side of her. The particular kind of pines that grow in Ocala, very tall and slender, with their foliage concentrated high up near the tops, leaving long, clean trunks below, and an open, airy, slightly otherworldly quality to the light filtering down through them. She loved that quality, that particular flavor of beautiful and slightly unsettling that you get in certain wild places where the silence is thick and the light moves strangely and everything around you is alive in ways you can't quite see or name. She was an experienced hiker. Not reckless, not foolish, but experienced enough to occasionally step off the marked trail for a short distance, just far enough to feel the raw, unmediated wildness of a place, away from the human footprint of the path. She'd done it dozens of times before without incident, always with care and awareness, always trusting her instincts about what looked safe and what didn't. She stepped off the trail. The ground beneath her feet was soft pine needle earth. giving slightly underfoot with that pleasant, cushioned feeling that comes from layers of fallen needles built up over years, not waterlogged, not muddy, not suspiciously yielding, just soft and pleasant and perfectly deceptively normal feeling. And then the ground swallowed her. There was no warning, no sound before it happened, just the sudden, absolute loss of solid earth beneath her feet as the surface gave way to nothing. And then she was falling, screaming, rushing air past her ears, and then a hard, brutal stop as the sinkhole narrowed toward the bottom and the earth closed in around her legs, pinning them, pressing all that weight and all that compacted soil against her from every direction. The scraping and tearing sensation as her legs were forced down through the narrowing walls of the hole was painful in the physical sense, but in the moment, the fear was so overwhelming that pain barely registered as its own separate thing. What she felt first and most powerfully was darkness closing in, air going thin and underground cool, and the absolute, terrifying inability to move. Her world had reduced itself to a narrow column of dim light above her, the hole she had fallen through, already partially obscured by the dirt she disturbed on the way down, and the solid, pressing earth all around her below. She couldn't reach her backpack. She couldn't get her hand anywhere near the pocket where her phone was. She was pinned in a way that left almost nothing in her control. Dirt had gotten into her eyes, and as she tried to wipe it away with fingers that couldn't quite reach properly, the dirt mixed with tears and turned to mud. But there was one thing she had. One thin, bright thread of hope that she held onto with everything she had. A Garmin InReach transponder, small as a deck of cards clipped to her backpack, connected to a satellite network, tracking her position constantly, and several people, her mother, her roommates, her two friends, had access to her location through that device. All they needed was her user ID and a simple password, and they could see exactly where she was on a website in real time. She couldn't activate the emergency SOS function herself, not with her pack inaccessible, but she didn't need to. All she had to do was be still long enough for someone to notice that her dot on the map hadn't moved, long enough for someone to notice she hadn't come home, long enough for someone to make a phone call. All she had to do was wait. And this is where the true test of a person's inner life begins, not in the dramatic crisis moment that's fueled by adrenaline and survival instinct which handle the immediate terror well enough. The real test comes in the long stretch afterward, when the adrenaline has drained away and you're left with nothing but the waiting and your own mind for company. She held on to her hope like a physical object she was terrified of dropping. She told herself the InReach was doing its job. She told herself someone would notice. She talked herself through the fear every time it started building towards something unmanageable, coaxing herself back from the edge with reminders of everything that was working in her favor. But then night came. The little blip of daylight above her faded out and disappeared. The hole went completely black. And then, not long after, it began to rain. Light rain. Just a gentle, steady patter from far above. But the sound of it, echoing oddly down through the darkness of that narrow underground space, and the feeling of it beginning to touch the earth around her, and the terrifying thought that followed, what if it fills up, triggered a whole new wave of panic that was different in quality from everything that had come before. This was the claustrophobic, drowning adjacent fear that lives somewhere very deep in the human animal and does not respond to rational reassurance. The insects were worse at night, too. They became more active as the temperature dropped and the moisture increased, and she felt them in her hair, on her neck, moving across her hands, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. She screamed, partly hoping to be heard, partly just because the combination of helplessness and disgust was more than she could contain in silence. The screaming helped a little, just the release of it. And through all of it, the one thought she kept returning to was the InReach. It's working, someone will notice, someone is going to come. She was right. Somewhere up in the world above her, someone had looked at a website and seen a dot that wasn't moving. Someone had tried calling. She felt her phone vibrate somewhere in her pocket, so close and so entirely out of reach. The vibrating stopped, then started again, stopped, started, short bursts, one after another, and then silence. Someone knew. She doesn't know exactly how long she waited after that. The hours in genuine darkness do strange things to time. But the phone started ringing again periodically, and each time she felt it vibrate, she felt that hope surge up inside her like something warm. She cried at one point, and the crying strangely helped. It released enough of the built-up tension to leave something almost like calm behind it. A fragile, exhausted calm, but enough to think clearly, enough to count, to breathe deliberately, to hold on. The panic came back when she heard voices. It came back loud and irrational, because the fear shifted from will they find me to what if they can't get me out. and that was its own particular horror, the kind you can't entirely think your way out of. She thought of the film about Aron Ralston, the man who spent 127 hours trapped with his arm pinned under a boulder and ultimately had to make an impossible choice to survive. She thought about that film more than once in those final dark hours. But the search and rescue team that had come for her were professionals of the highest order, and what had taken Aron Ralston days to resolve, they assessed in minutes. The walls of the sinkhole were stable enough for an extraction without major excavation. They lowered a medic down to her first, a woman who brought water and administered it through a tube and kept talking in a low, steady, completely reassuring voice the entire time. Then came the person responsible for planning the extraction, who assessed the situation, confirmed the walls were holding, and told her clearly and calmly that she would be home and safe very soon. 2 more rescue workers came down and worked carefully around her, using small collapsible tools to gently loosen the compacted earth around her hips and legs. When she finally came free, the sensation of movement returning felt like waking up. They eased her into a bright orange rescue litter, a hard, reinforced stretcher with straps and a safety harness, clipped her in securely, radioed to the team above, and then a winch drew them all steadily, smoothly upward. She came out of the ground, into dark, rainy air, and it was one of the best moments of her life. An ambulance was waiting on the trail. There had been a helicopter on standby, too, just in case she'd been brought up with more serious injuries. But she hadn't. A heavily sprained ankle, some scrapes on her legs, and an experience that would take a long time to fully process, but she was fundamentally okay. From the moment she fell to the moment she was walking back through her own front door, 13 or 14 hours had elapsed. It felt like she had been underground for weeks. She still hikes. She hikes with her husband now, and with her 2 children, in places that are a little more modest and a little more forgiving than the Ocala wilderness on a solo afternoon. And she is grateful for every single one of those hikes, in a way that she suspects she will feel for the rest of her life. And if there is one thing she says to her kids, one piece of advice that comes from the most visceral and personal experience imaginable, it's this: stay on the trail. Thank you so much for spending this time with us tonight. These stories remind us that the world outside our doors is astonishing and beautiful and humbling, and that it deserves our full respect every single time we step into it. If any of these accounts touched you, or if you've had your own unsettling experience out in the wilderness that you've never shared with anyone, the comments are open, and we would genuinely love to hear from you. What do you think was really going on with that boy in the Ozarks? Was Cornbread a harmless eccentric, or was there something darker underneath all those peculiar rituals? Drop your thoughts below. We read everything. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with someone in your life who loves a good story told on a quiet night. Every share helps more people find this channel and join this community. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we post something new. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? There are so many more stories where these came from, and we'll see you very soon for the next one. Stay safe out there, friends. And remember, stay on the trail.